Hello everyone, my name is Chase Douglas and I'm the event coordinator here at Eco Canada. So today to kick off the webinar, we'll get some things started. So next slide there, Calvin. So traditional land acknowledgement. Eco Canada and myself would like to recognize today and every day the land we are on. Eco Canada is committed to reconciliation, starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within this Indigenous territory. Eco Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and the oral practices of these Indigenous nations. Next slide there, Calvin. So just go over some housekeeping with everyone. All participants are muted during this presentation. For any technical issues, you can use the question box function and select Eco Canada. The webinar will be sent out of recording of this within 24 hours after the webinar is finished. And then at the end of the discussion, we'll have a time for questions. So just kind of hold your questions to the end, and those can be submitted through the question function box as well. So a little bit about Eco Canada and who we are. Eco Canada is the steward of the Canadian environmental workforce across all industries. We champion an end-to-end career of an environmental professional. We not only train and certify professionals, but we also help identify and address labor market gaps. Our efforts promote and drive for sustainable economic growth to ensure that the environmental care and best practices is a priority. Slide. So who's presenting today? So we'll be having Calvin from Alberta Municipalities speaking today. And then to start things off, I'm going to hand it over to Matthew, who is our program coordinator here at Eco Canada. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Matthew. I'm a program coordinator at Eco Canada, and I'm involved in several initiatives aimed at promoting sustainable technologies and practices here. So thank you, Chase, for introducing me. I'm going to give a quick overview of ZEV, which essentially is the overarching project that led to this webinar today. So ZEV stands for Zero Emission Vehicle Awareness Initiative, and it's a project undertaken by ECO and funded by Natural Resources Canada. So the ZEV project is designed to increase awareness and accelerate the adoption of zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles, or MHDVs, across Canada. So we focus on particularly on engaging with Indigenous, rural, and remote communities, as well as small businesses and transportation companies, as these are pivotal in the shift towards sustainable transportation. So our approach includes educational webinars like the one we're having today. There's also hands-on workshops, there's in-person sessions, panel discussions, and a few other formats. And in those, we just delve into the benefits, the challenges, the myths, and practical considerations of transitioning to medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. So our primary goal is not only to inform, but also to empower people by providing the tools and knowledge necessary to make informed decisions. We aim to foster a robust dialogue on how zero-emission MHDVs can be integrated effectively into their operations. So it's crucial for us to address this, as the transportation sector is a significant contributor to national emissions. And we think that by focusing on MHDVs, we're targeting a space that has a lot of potential for impact. So that's it for a bit of an intro to the ZEV project. And I'm going to hand you over now to Calvin, who's going to lead us in the rest of the webinar. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Matthew, for the intro. Hi, everyone. My name is Calvin Lechelt. As mentioned, I'm a program manager with the Municipal Climate Change Action Center and the Sustainability Services Department of Alberta Municipalities. Happy to be with all of you this afternoon to talk about medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles in Canada, but also a little bit more broadly. And this is the second part of a two-part webinar series on medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. So if you missed that first edition, I'm going to go over that very briefly, a very high-level review, but you can either check out that webinar on Eco Canada's website, or we're going to be aiming to get that up on our YouTube page as well for all of you to recap that presentation. So before I jump into all of the detail, just going to go through the agenda really quickly. So we're going to give an introduction on the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. Again, like I mentioned, a brief recap of the first webinar completed by my colleague Logan. Then we'll get into really the meat of the presentation after that, talking about challenges, and specifically challenges as they relate to emissions, infrastructure, and costs for different technology types. We'll get into opportunities, a handful of case studies of different technologies and companies and pilot projects that are underway, and then wrap up with looking ahead to where this technology is going into the future. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Action Centre, we were established in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between Alberta municipalities, the rural municipalities of Alberta, and the government of Alberta. And the Action Centre provides funding, technical assistance, and education to help Alberta municipalities and nonprofits in addressing climate change. And we've ran a handful of at least electric vehicle specific rebate programs and education programs over the past 6 or so years. So we are actually celebrating our 15-year anniversary this year. So we always like to share a little bit about the impact that we've had over that time period. I won't go through all of these stats, but some of the pieces we're most proud of is that we've worked with over 400 unique participants on now over 1,000 unique projects. And we're getting pretty close to 1 megaton worth of CO2 emission savings over the lifetime of all of the projects we've been involved in. So getting into the review of webinar 1, I just felt as though it's important to set the context as to why we're talking about medium and heavy duty EVs. And really, I think it's important to ask kind of what are the issues that medium and heavy duty vehicles, and specifically zero emission vehicles, are trying to solve. So as Logan would have mentioned in the first webinar, really the issue is that the transportation sector makes up a really high portion of Canada's emissions as the second largest source at 22% in 2022 at 156 megatons. So reducing transportation emissions is really crucial to meeting any of our climate goals. And even more so, if we look at the piece of the pie of where Canada's emissions are coming from, it's the transportation emissions specifically that are growing quite rapidly. So transportation emissions are up about 33% since 1990. And a big portion of that growth actually comes from an increase in heavy duty freight trucks and also people moving a little bit more to larger passenger vehicles, so things like trucks and SUVs. But specifically, the heavy duty freight emissions have doubled since 1990. So that kind of sets the stage as to why this is a challenge that we're looking to address with zero emission vehicles. Really briefly, again, only talking about these two vehicle categories. Really any vehicle type that has a gross vehicle weight over roughly 4,500 kilograms or 4.5 tons. So that includes classes 2 through 8, things like utility vans, dump trucks, semi-trucks, coach buses, generally large commercial and in some cases industrial vehicles. So we talked about the emissions pie overall, but this kind of shows the breakdown, at least within the transportation sector specifically. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's pretty big chunks coming from passenger vehicles, whether they're cars or light trucks. But the next highest category after looking at passenger vehicles is, again, the freight at about 24% of the overall transportation emissions. So really there are two emerging technology types that can help transition the transportation sector towards lower emitting operations, and those are battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So both are in fairly early stages still, but just to kind of recap as to how those two vehicle types work, starting on the left, battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, use pretty straightforward electricity stored within a battery, stored in the vehicle. That electricity then helps to move the vehicle through a fairly efficient electric motor, generally being about 80 to 90% efficient. So there's a big gain there on internal combustion engine vehicles. Battery electric vehicles are starting to become more and more common, but more so in the light duty category. So really all the biggest OEM manufacturers have at least one battery electric vehicle on the market, with some kind of taking a bit more of a leadership role in that. Obviously Tesla, they only sell EVs, but household names, Ford, Hyundai, Chevy, Nissan, and so forth, all offering electric vehicles, at least in the light duty category for now. Moving over to the right-hand side, hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, just hydrogen fuel cell vehicles power the vehicle in a similar way, but instead of a large battery, they use hydrogen stored in a fuel tank. That hydrogen is fed through what is called a fuel cell and a fuel cell stack, which reacts with oxygen to produce electricity to then move the vehicle. So again, there's an electric motor. At least in that sense, the two vehicles are fairly similar. And hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are certainly less common than BEVs for all vehicle categories, specifically the light duty category as well. Quickly just going over advantages of both vehicle types. On the electric side, there's no tailpipe emissions, and really regardless of where you are charging that electric vehicle, you will have reduced emissions just due to the fact that the vehicle is significantly more efficient as compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle that's roughly 20% efficient. They have lower fuel and maintenance costs, overall quite a bit lower total cost of ownership, which is kind of one of the big value pieces that comes with EVs. They have fewer moving parts, less mechanical breakdowns, they're quiet, they have what's called regenerative braking. So instead of slamming on the brake, you can actually recoup that electricity in the motion that you have to then pull back into the battery. And a lot of the time you can utilize existing electrical infrastructure. In terms of disadvantages, the EVs generally have reduced range compared to internal combustion engine vehicles. There's downtime while charging. They're more expensive. They can be heavy. They're, at least in the medium and heavy duty context, being heavy can reduce your payload capacity. And currently there is limited commercial scale fast charging infrastructure above 150 kilowatts. That would be kind of good to note for, again, the medium and heavy duty sector. When it comes to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, they only emit water vapor. They're comparable to range with internal combustion engine vehicles or ICEVs. Somewhat comparable refueling times. That's really going to depend on the pressure involved in the refueling station. It's a little bit longer than what it would take to fill up a gas or diesel vehicle, but still relatively comparable. Again, quiet operation. They also have regenerative braking, and something that's an advantage but also could be a disadvantage is that hydrogen can have low carbon intensity. It all comes down to how that hydrogen is produced. In terms of disadvantages, hydrogen is pretty tricky to store and transport, and that entire process, as we'll get into in a bit more detail, can be really costly. Currently, there's pretty limited refueling infrastructure. The fuel itself is costly. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are not as efficient as battery electrics, coming in at about 40 to 60% efficient. So still certainly more efficient than your internal combustion engine vehicle, but kind of the middle ground in terms of efficiency. Again, more expensive currently than traditional combustion engines. And again, we'll get into hydrogen can in some cases not have low carbon intensity, and we'll kind of get into how you determine that. So I stumbled upon this graph, and I thought it was a good kind of stage setting graph for what is the current scenario when it comes to these two technology types, specifically for heavy duty trucks. So the International Energy Agency develops all sorts of different data around EV and hydrogen fuel cell vehicle uptake. And so this graph shows uptake cumulative annual sales, or sorry, it's not cumulative actually, it's individual each year annual sales worldwide for these vehicle types from 2019. So you can see that they both have pretty decent growth over that time, but there is by far and away one winner in terms of uptake to date, and that's battery electric trucks. I got the sense from looking at that data that a good amount of that uptake, at least for battery electrics, is taking place in China. And that makes sense because they are the world's leading battery manufacturer to date. But definitely interesting to see what the uptake is for these two vehicle types. And really both of them would be dwarfed, to be honest, compared to the annual sales of diesel vehicles, but we'll see over time how that may change. Getting into some of the challenges around emissions, starting with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Again, I mentioned this, emissions really depend on the hydrogen production process. Alberta specifically is being positioned as Canada's hydrogen hub and is actually trying to position itself as that hydrogen hub to produce pretty large quantities of what's called blue hydrogen. So I'm not going to get into all the different colors of hydrogen. Logan covered that in detail, but just for context sake, blue hydrogen is produced via methane paired with carbon capture. And that carbon capture piece is really important because that's really where it will dictate the carbon intensity of that blue hydrogen. So carbon capture and storage projects are in the news quite a bit here lately. And to date, a lot of them have targets in the 80–90% of emissions range, but operationally, they're looking to only actually capture about 35–65% of emissions. So that also needs to be considered when you're talking about emissions for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. But also, and this kind of applies to both hydrogen and EVs, depending on what fuel type actually fuels the electricity grid. So in Alberta's case, and we'll get into this, a lot of that is through natural gas. And there's a good amount of upstream methane emissions via flaring, venting, and leakage that will also contribute to overall emissions. The challenging piece there is that capturing or quantifying the amount of emissions from those different processes is really challenging. So a lot of the time when you hear someone talk about emissions from these vehicle types, it's really not quite that far upstream, if that makes sense. So on the electric vehicle side of things, again, no tailpipe emissions, but we do need to be considering the source of the electricity and how that electricity is generated to estimate emissions. Emissions are, so instead of hydrogen, where emissions are really dependent on how that hydrogen is made, emissions from EVs can end up being dependent on where that vehicle is charging. So how versus where. So, across Canada, we have electricity grids that vary in their fuel makeup. So the emissions, if you're charging in, say, BC, could be very different from the emissions if you're charging in Alberta. But across the board, regardless of where you're charging your vehicle, you will be reducing emissions. On the right-hand side here, you can see the electricity production makeup across Canada. So roughly 75% of our electricity grids are non-emitting. This is a bit of an old graph. That 7% made up of coal and coke is actually quite a bit lower now, I would imagine, given Alberta has fully phased out coal in the electricity grid. So if we were just looking at Alberta specifically, you can see the capacity of the grid here in this pie chart, with gas making up the majority and about 30-35% renewables from wind, solar, and hydro. So again, just to try to drive home that point of emissions, tried to plot out two different vehicles, both Hyundai Konas. It's a passenger vehicle, not exactly the same as what we're talking about today when it comes to medium heavy duty, but it illustrates the point. So emissions from driving 20,000 kilometers per year in Alberta, you can see the internal combustion engine Kona is flat. It's not going to change, whereas the EV actually starts to get cleaner as our grid ends up getting cleaner. And this is using data from the Government of Alberta's carbon emission offset handbook and the forecast that they've provided in that handbook out to 2029. So those emissions are not stagnant. It will depend on the mix of the grid at that time. Moving over to infrastructure, this is also a really big challenge with both of these technology types. Starting with hydrogen refueling stations, you can see on the map here that there are not many. There are a total of 6 across the country, with 5 being in BC and 1 in Quebec. The caveat here is that Air Products is developing a whole bunch of new refueling stations between Calgary and Edmonton, with the intent there being for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And the same is happening in BC with another 20 stations. So the approach with all of these networks that are being built out is that they're targeted specifically for trucking. And that's in some cases a disadvantage that hydrogen has over battery electric vehicles, is that depot refueling, where you park your vehicles at night, is unlikely to be feasible in the hydrogen context. So this is the equivalent map when it comes to electric vehicle chargers, although I'll fully admit this map includes both what are considered slower chargers, usually referred to as level 2 chargers, and level 3 or DC fast chargers. But you can still see there's a good amount of more charging locations across the country. Data from about 2022 from Natural Resources Canada found that there's just under 5,000 DC fast chargers across the country, and that number is continuing to grow with some of the investments that Enercan is making. Overall, the federal government's looking to invest over $1 billion to hit a goal of just under 85,000 chargers by 2029. Now, again, that does include level 2, but in that number, there's probably about 15,000 to 20,000 fast chargers. But in the medium and heavy duty context, really keeping a keen eye on what's called the megawatt charging system. Megawatt charging is just that much more powerful, anywhere between 1 and about 3.5 megawatts. And that's expected to be commercially available in 2027. So it's still on its way. But there are several in the US, specifically in California, that seem to be working quite well. We'll get into kind of advantages, disadvantages, but specifically medium duty EVs are quite a bit more likely to utilize depot charging and not have to rely so much on this public charging infrastructure because of just generally shorter routes and overnight charging. So keeping with that infrastructure theme, moving back over to hydrogen, I mentioned there's challenges when it comes to infrastructure for both vehicle types. So we'll get into some of those challenges. The first being with hydrogen is really the costs. So both the hydrogen commodity, but also the refueling stations, the costs are fairly significant. Refueling stations with a decent enough capacity of over 1,200 kilograms per day, which is roughly the capacity you would need for medium and heavy duty vehicles at any degree of volume are roughly $2 million USD each. So that's definitely something you'd need to consider if you are considering adding hydrogen fuel cell vehicles to your fleet. And also a big disadvantage or challenge that they have is that very few components of the existing electrical or gasoline or diesel infrastructure can be leveraged to then repurpose it for hydrogen dispensing. There's a lot of talk about potentially using existing pipeline networks for hydrogen, which in theory is possible. You can blend hydrogen in existing natural gas pipelines, but that's generally for heating applications only, because it's not a pure enough hydrogen for what your vehicle would need. And even just injecting pure hydrogen into existing pipelines, again, technically feasible, but it would add pretty significant and costly modifications to those pipelines to handle the high pressures that come with hydrogen dispensing. Keeping with that hydrogen refueling challenge, a handful of pieces across the supply chain, and when it comes to specific dispensing, mentioned this a little bit, that hydrogen needs to be compressed to pretty high pressures to be stored and dispensed, adding complexity with additional compressors, an on-site storage tank, in some cases on-site cooling for the hydrogen, and that kind of all adds to, again, the complexity and the cost for maintaining and operating that type of system. But transporting the hydrogen to a refueling station also has some challenges as well, as transport containers can have some issues with boil off of hydrogen when the heat is introduced from pressurization. And again, all of that adds just complexity to the system. So when I was researching for this presentation, I came across a handful of pretty attention-grabbing headlines that companies really around the world, from the UK to Germany, California, even some in Japan, are closing their existing hydrogen stations, citing insufficient demand, challenges scaling, and also, I found this interesting, reliability issues due to, again, some of the complexity in operating one of these stations. But the nice thing to hear is that it didn't really sound, or I didn't get that sense from any of the news articles, that any of these suppliers are shifting their focus away from hydrogen entirely. They would just be shifting more away from the passenger side towards heavy duty vehicles, which is what we're talking about, obviously, construction equipment, and buses and rail. When it comes to EV charging challenges, install costs for depot charging is definitely an added cost that you can avoid if you have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, because that cost is on the supplier, the fuel supplier, and not so much you as a business or other operator. That being said, this is a cost, but it can actually offer some beneficial opportunities a little bit further into the future. We'll get into some of those here soon. But it's not as easy as just plugging your heavy duty vehicle into the wall. So you may need some upstream electrical distribution infrastructure upgrades, like new transformers, potentially distribution lines. But there's, again, some ways to mitigate that challenge. And as you may have heard in the news, a large number of EVs can strain electrical grids and local distribution infrastructure. That may also lead to not only electrical upgrades being needed, but increased electrical demand charges. Luckily, there are some strategies around load management and other specific technologies that can be pretty crucial to help you avoid a lot of those electrical upgrades and help maximize the use of existing infrastructure. So things like charging off-peak hours or power sharing across multiple chargers, utilities, and this is location specific, but utilities offering time of use pricing, all of those types of things can help you reduce any added costs when it comes to EVs in your fleet and the charging infrastructure. I want to touch a little bit on manufacturing challenges for both vehicle types and environmental impact, because that's something that is a common question as well. So both vehicle types, they both have manufacturing challenges and also associated environmental impacts due to mining of raw materials. Both have batteries, just battery electric vehicles tend to have much larger batteries that obviously use more minerals. But hydrogen fuel cell vehicles use other minerals that aren't as common in battery electrics that are quite rare and costly, like platinum in some of the hydrogen fuel cell stacks to act as catalysts. So that can be a cost that can be hard to avoid. And obviously the mining impact that goes along with that. And there's ethical concerns around cobalt mining for batteries, and that's kind of pushing this drive to replace cobalt with other battery chemistries, such as lithium iron phosphate and others. Luckily, there are some battery chemistries that are coming out that are using a little bit more abundant materials, such as sodium in sodium ion batteries, and that helps reduce cost and mining impact. And luckily, there's a growing battery repurposing and recycling industry that will help reduce the raw material demand over time. But that looks as though that might be hitting a bit more higher scale in that 5 to 10 year time frame as opposed to today. So just to get into opportunities. We talked about some of the challenges, but there's certainly some opportunities with both vehicle types. So hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are really showing promise when you are in a scenario with one or more of these following conditions. So if you're in extreme temperatures where maybe it's minus 20 and colder, certainly we get minus 20 and colder here in Alberta and across Canada. That's where hydrogen vehicles will definitely or could perform quite well. Pairing that with long distances and heavy payloads, along with a kind of a centralized hub and spoke distribution model where you can have very, very short hydrogen supply chains, potentially fueling up right where hydrogen is produced, say in an industrial setting, can certainly help avoid some of those refueling costs when it comes to installing those stations, and in situations where there's high uptime requirements. So this makes me think about construction equipment or other equipment that doesn't have the downtime available to stop and charge. The flip side, opportunities for battery electric vehicles are again kind of just the value proposition kind of just grows as you add a lot of these different scenarios. So daily driving profiles of equal to or less than 300 kilometers, pairing that with last mile delivery, again, kind of a regional hub and spoke model will work well with an EV fleet. Touched on this a little bit, but the opportunity to leverage vehicle to X, and all that means is vehicle to either vehicle to grid or vehicle to building or vehicle to load. That typically happens through your charging station. That kind of your charging station enables V to X. So what you might want to do there, and this is still certainly a component that is growing, that utilities need to be developing regulations around, but could be something that adds to that value proposition in the future is, say, you only drove 100 kilometers during the day, and you plug your vehicle in overnight, and potentially you could actually be sending electricity back to the grid and being compensated for that. So that's one opportunity that exists with battery electrics, that fuel cell vehicles may not have that opportunity because of the connection point with the refueling infrastructure. That's in-house in your depot. You enable that as a future opportunity. Also, you have the option to integrate with on-site renewables, whether that's, in most cases, that would be solar. and that helps to further decrease fuel costs, but also achieve long-term fuel cost certainty, and that just reduces risk, and that's generally attractive. And we're not going to get into this too much in this presentation, but there's also economic development opportunities with the Canadian EV supply chain. The federal government's putting quite a bit of funding to build out that Canadian EV supply chain and have it be a little bit more vertically integrated, because we have a lot of mining and minerals in this country, and there's an existing automotive workforce further east out in Ontario. That there's a lot of, or perceived to be a lot of value in that. And what comes with that is greater energy independence as well. All right, so now we'll get into a handful of case studies across Canada. So Tim Hortons, they're running 2 Volvo electric Class 8 semi-trucks with about 440 kilometers of range in both Guelph and Langley, BC. Again, relatively short routes, like I had mentioned, daily routes, 150 to 200 kilometers each day, and they're having success with that. Walmart, same kind of thing, out in BC, in Surrey, they have 3 Freightliner eCascadia semi-trucks. Again, that medium route length is 150, 200 kilometers. They're seeing a good amount of fuel savings, and fuel cost savings as well, so I'm sure they're happy about that. I think probably the largest electric semi-fleet that I was able to find in Canada was for Loblaws, both in Montreal and Vancouver. They have 14 of the Freightliner eCascadias. They're operating those vehicles in 2 shifts a day. This is at least specifically in Vancouver. 1 shift moving goods to and from ports, and then another shift making store deliveries, and that seems to be working well for them. And this is all a part of their goal to operate a net zero fleet as early as 2030. So, when you're operating and planning fleet expansion, 2030 is might as well be next week. That's very soon, but as far as I could tell, they're really pushing for that with another 25 additional Tesla semis on order as well. And speaking of the Tesla semi, PepsiCo in Fresno seems to have the largest electric semi fleet, from what I could tell, across North America, operating 86 Tesla Class 8 semi trucks. All with roughly 800 kilometers range. They put in an order for 100, so they'll actually be getting another 14. So quite a large electric fleet. Most of them operating pretty long hours, roughly 12 hours a day, again with relatively short routes, about 160 kilometers. That being said, a small portion of these 86 are actually doing medium and long haul routes with pretty significantly heavy payloads. You would imagine, Pepsi or soft drinks at roughly 82,000 pounds, as far as 720 kilometers a day. So the heavy weight of the battery doesn't seem to be impacting the payload capacities quite as much in this context. We'll see to what extent that continues with different payloads. And they also have roughly 8, I think they probably have more, but I could only find a stat for roughly 8 750 kilowatt mega chargers that are recharging these vehicles from about 10% to 75% in as little as 45 minutes. So that's pretty impressive as well. The advantage, obviously, that California has over, say, Alberta is the relatively nice weather. So moving over to Alberta, that is really where a lot of the hydrogen vehicles are being tested out. So the Alberta Zero Emission Truck Electrification Collaboration is going to be operating 2 long-range fuel cell electric trucks for operation between Edmonton and Calgary. using technology from Ballard, which is, if you're not familiar, a fuel cell provider out in BC, a roughly 280 kilowatt fuel cell. And they're estimating about 25% well-to-wheel emissions from using hydrogen. And I think it's just important to note again that the hydrogen that is going to be fueling these trucks is not planned to be paired with carbon capture and storage. So maybe that changes in the future, but at this point, those emissions aren't quite as steep of a drop from what you would be emitting with the diesel truck anyways. Staying here in Alberta, there's the Alberta Zero Emission Hydrogen Transit Project, where the Edmonton Transit Service and Strathcona County Transit, they started this pilot in 2023, running 2 New Flyer fuel cell buses with roughly 480 kilometers of range. Roughly a 2-year pilot at about $11 million. They received roughly $5 million from emissions reduction in Alberta, and they're actually refueling at the Suncor Energy Refinery just adjacent to Strathcona County, as that's where there's a pretty significant hydrogen production taking place at that refinery regardless. So again, kind of what I mentioned, very, very short hydrogen supply chains. And both communities are going to be monitoring performance to compare against diesel and compressed natural gas, but also their existing battery electric buses. And finally, still again, staying in Alberta, lots happening in the hydrogen space in Alberta. The Alberta Motor Transportation Association just did a demonstration this past January, driving this Nikola Class 8 fuel cell semi with a Bison transport trailer weighing roughly 14,000 pounds from Edmonton to Calgary. So doing that in January, obviously cold temperatures, it was roughly 0 to minus 11 during that journey, and they completed the trip using roughly 61% of the hydrogen tank. So that gave them a nice bit of confidence that they could also do that trip with a loaded trailer, given they still had some capacity with their hydrogen tank. So moving over to kind of looking ahead into the future, I wanted to touch on this hydrogen ladder, as this can kind of act as a guide as to where specifically hydrogen may play a role in certain applications into the future. So this was developed by Michael Liebreich. He's the founder of New Energy Finance that was then since acquired by Bloomberg, and now the CEO of Liebreich Associates. He's been developing this hydrogen ladder over the past several years as the energy transition is evolving, and he's been shuffling different things around. But really, yeah, it just looks at those potential use cases of hydrogen and gauges how likely that each may be a significant user of hydrogen in 10 to 15 years compared to other competing technologies. So the top few rows, A through C, in some cases D, are really likely for hydrogen to have a very significant market share in those applications. And then further down is where hydrogen might be less competitive against other technologies, but could have niche applications under certain conditions. So if we look at what we're talking about today, and heavy duty, medium duty trucks, coaches, regional trucks, metros, metro trains and buses, they're kind of in the middle. But when it comes to buses, at least the Michael Liebreich is sensing that buses certainly would not be overly competitive against battery electric vehicles. But that long distance trucks and coaches coming in at right around the middle rung of the ladder, there could be some applications there and some market share for hydrogen to grab. And that's kind of what we're seeing, at least in Alberta, is that the climate is a challenge. And it's a challenge for battery electric vehicles, particularly in the winter with long distances. And that's something that hydrogen could come in and fill that niche. But based on this ladder, it seems as though it's unlikely that that may be the case worldwide. It might, again, just be specific conditions. So just to wrap up, both hydrogen and battery electric trucks are still in kind of that innovator or early adopter phase. But looking ahead, I think it's important to kind of consider what factors are really important to moving towards mass adoption. And we talked about some of these throughout this presentation. So infrastructure deployment, first and foremost, will on the battery electric side, megawatt scale charging, to what extent will that be deployed? Will hydrogen refueling infrastructure grow to enable increased adoption? Cost parity and incentives, will there still be incentives? How close will both technologies be to cost parity on a total cost of ownership basis in the next 5 to 10 years? Remains to be seen. Technology developments, will battery chemistries change? Will something dramatically change for longer ranges in both vehicles or greater efficiency, reduce costs? Also remains to be seen. And will for environmental impact, will hydrogen production become cleaner with CCS? Will we have greater upstream efficiencies? And will battery chemistries change? Like I mentioned, will sodium ion batteries really take off? Those are all really important questions that still need to be answered. And what about the impact of elections? There's a few pretty significant elections that are scheduled to take place, and how will that impact the growth of both technologies? So it'll be really interesting to watch over the next 4, 5, 6 years as these really get up and going. Oh, and now looks like I lost the presentation, but we were right at the end anyway. So anyway, thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful for some people. Happy to open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Calvin. So I'm going to start here. The first question I have here, which is, besides hydrogen, there are far cheaper, more practical net zero fuels, including ethanol from waste, landfills, CNG, bioethane, CNG, bioaminos, biourea, bio-oil, biodiesel, even synthetic drop in replacement of pi gas and pi gasoline, no question mark.
I guess the question is kind of asking to what extent those other fuels may compete with hydrogen and battery electric. And yeah, there could be some potential there. I feel I have the sense as though some of those fuels derived from organic materials may end up more so displacing current gasoline and diesel consumption, and not so much hampering the growth of, say, battery electric vehicles. It'll be kind of an and situation. One thing that can be challenging with some of those fuels, though, particularly ethanol, is really the politics behind it, the debate as to what extent should we be using farmland to grow different crops for ethanol or biodiesel as opposed to food. I don't know that I have the answer as to where that's going to shake out over the next even 10 or 20 years. But going back to the hydrogen ladder, there were some use cases of hydrogen that are probably going to be not quite competitive against some of those fuels, particularly drop-in fuels that can be used in existing combustion engine vehicles. But again, I don't know that those other fuels are necessarily manufactured at scale at this point that at a large enough scale that will necessarily displace the growth that's happening, at least in battery electric vehicles. So it's an and situation. Yeah, you can do both.
Thank you for that, Calvin. Next question. Any comparison related to the tires used in these vehicles and the new manufactured tires for EV vehicles? Question mark heavier.
Yeah, there's definitely been some pieces of news that are coming out as it relates to the weight of the vehicle and to what extent EVs specifically, and also even more so maybe in medium heavy duty vehicles may need specialized tires. I didn't come across any of that. For example, the type or thickness of tires that, say, PepsiCo is using for their fleet. But I would imagine with that added weight, you may want to consider the tires that are being used and make sure that they are going to last given those added weights. So I wouldn't, to be honest, wouldn't be surprised if as uptake continues to develop, if some of those tire manufacturers just end up changing their product to be a little bit thicker, and maybe there's some chemistry opportunities there to make the rubber a little bit more resilient to those heavier weights.
Awesome, thank you. Next question here. You talked about a lot of things, and it seems there are huge challenges everywhere. So, question number one, what takeaways should I keep in mind from this webinar? And question number two, what future mobility would you like in Canada? Question mark, EVs, HFC vehicles, or a mix of those, and why?
Right. Okay. So there's a lot in there. I might need you to repeat it, but at least the first part, in terms of takeaways, I hope I wasn't overly negative as it relates to both technologies, because there's a good amount of promise. That being said, I was trying to maybe just convey that there are challenges. Some challenges, or really all of the challenges, are technically feasible to solve. It's maybe a little bit more a question of which one makes more business case for, or a better business case for what scenario. So we talked about hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and there may be a stronger business case based on the kind of driving profile that the company is using that vehicle in. In certain situations, again, short supply chains for the hydrogen, long routes, cold temperatures, those types of things, where it seems as though, and the hydrogen ladder kind of confirms, maybe not officially confirms this, but aligns with this, is that battery electrics kind of take everything else aside from operating in those cold temperatures, long distances, and so on. That seems to be the way things are trending. So yeah, there are challenges, but really none of the challenges are things that we can't solve. And sorry, maybe I'll get you to repeat the second part of that question.
Yeah, for sure. The second question is, the second part of it would be what the future mobility would like to see in Canada, EVs, HFCs, vehicles, or a mix of those, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily up to me, but the sense that I have is that it will be a mix, where in some climates, say in BC in particular, there might, the penetration of battery electrics up that ladder in terms of the heavier and heavier vehicles, battery electrics might reach a little bit higher penetration, whereas in Alberta, maybe Saskatchewan, where there is a lot of trucking, maybe that battery electrics don't reach as far. But I guess in terms of what I would like to see, if I had if I was energy czar and could make decisions like that, I'd like to see more infrastructure, but also really make sure that the emission side of the puzzle here is not forgotten about. So, in the battery electric context, there are still emissions, even though there are not emissions from the tailpipe. So cleaning up the grid to reduce those emissions, whether that's carbon capture associated with natural gas power plants, that could help. But on the hydrogen side as well, cleaning up the emissions from that, because a lot of it's great, don't get me wrong, that some of these pilots that I talked about are happening in Alberta, but I believe none of them are actually using carbon capture and storage quite yet. And I know that's the long-term goal, but we're not necessarily reducing emissions as much as we could be when pairing those. But also just making sure that, and I'm certainly no expert in carbon capture and storage, but increasing that storage and capturing percentage, getting closer to what some of these companies are aiming for at 90%, because they still have a little ways to go if they're only capturing about 50% of that carbon. And to what extent is that even worthwhile, given there's still emissions associated with the hydrogen in that case? Is it just are you just better off to go electric? Again, that'll kind of depend. So appreciate the question. That's a great question.
Awesome, thanks. Next question here is, what are the technical challenges to operation of BEVs in cold climates? Is there any R&D in the progress to enable those, or is it likely not feasible at all?
It kind of, again, just depends on the use case. But in the medium and heavy duty context, you'll just need to prepare that, if your vehicle has, say, a stated range of 400 kilometers, in minus 25, minus 30, that may drop to something like 250 or 300 kilometers. So you just need to plan around that. Is there any R&D that may limit the impact of cold temperatures? Potentially. I didn't really get into it, but there's a lot of excitement around solid state batteries. All that means is that their electrolyte is solid and not aqueous or liquid. So that may add some benefits in cold climates, but also it's the charging infrastructure as well. So when you pull up to a charger when your battery is cold, your charger isn't able to push as much power as it otherwise would in, say, 20 or 21 degrees Celsius into your battery. So if that charger already was capped at, say, 100 kilowatts, maybe you're only getting 50 or 55. But on the higher end, once we have more of that commercial scale charging infrastructure that I talked about, above 150 kilowatts, some of those challenges will end up being mitigated, because even though it's cold, 150 kilowatt charger, you could still be getting 75, and in some cases that still might make it worthwhile and convenient enough for you to continue your daily route. So I hope that answered the question. Maybe Matthew, if you wouldn't mind just throwing my email address into the chat, that'd be appreciated. I actually had that on the last slide and maybe got a little bit aggressive with my scrolling finger and missed that. So happy to take any questions after the presentation. If you want to send me an email, yeah, that would be great. But we still have roughly 2 minutes for additional questions.
Yeah, I think I have one last question here for you.
Sure.
There are so many different types of medium and heavy duty vehicles. With current technology, what type of vehicles make the most sense to look into switching to alternate fuels?
I'm assuming they mean alternate fuels, like the other attendee mentioned, like biofuels and other things of that nature. To me, they're different technologies and different fuels. So again, like it kind of depends on how you're operating your fleet and what are your needs. Are you driving long distances, like over 500, 600, 700 kilometers a day, that use case may push you towards a certain vehicle type and a certain fuel type. But if it's more kind of medium scale routes, the business case, because that's all what it all comes down to is what is the business case? Where can you check the most boxes when it comes to cost, emissions, any other value add propositions, those types of things. So I guess I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. It just depends on the situation. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Calvin. Really appreciate it. I did drop your email there in the chat function there, so everyone can grab that if they like. Just remind everyone there will be a recording of this sent out to everyone within 24 hours after the webinar. If not, you can always reach out to events@eco.ca. I'll definitely be able to get in contact with you and get you what you need. But thank you very much, Calvin. Really appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see everyone in the next couple of webinars. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.